All right, well, we'll get started. My name is Miriam Boucher. I'm a PhD student with the WISE Lab out at the Baruch Coastal Institute. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Matt Shirley. Matt is a colleague and a friend. I met him 10 years ago in South Africa at my first crocodile specialist group meeting. And he was one of the first people that made me feel welcome and helped me start to get my feet into the sometimes shallow, often muddy waters of crocodilian research. Since then, he's also been a part of the journey of a couple other grad students here at Clemson, Bobby Greco and Hallie Cohen, that are both doing crocodilian work as well. So Matt is an associate research scientist at Florida International University. He's also the chair of the West Africa and Central Africa working group for the crocodile specialist group, and he's the chair of the IUCN pangolin specialist group. He's got field stories for days, almost as many as he is tall. And I'm excited for him to speak to us a little bit about his work and his journey as a professional. So thanks, Matt.
Cool, thanks. I'm gonna move this mic so that I don't get any feedback. Hopefully that's okay for everybody. You guys can hear me in the back? All right, excellent. So thanks, Miriam, and thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be here with you guys. The talk I'm going to give today is a little bit of an exposure of kind of my overall program, what I'm trying to do with crocodiles, what I'm trying to do with pangolins. And Miriam in particular thought it would be interesting for the grad students to kind of hear a little bit more about what I do to, let's say, scale up the impact of my work through global networks like the IUCN specialist groups and policy forums like CITES. And so I'm going to try and sprinkle in a handful of lessons learned and those sorts of things throughout. And hope everyone's excited to learn a bit more about crocodilians in another part of the world and pangolins, which I don't think you guys hear too much about. But here we go. So crocodilians, of course, as we know, are giant, potentially terrifying, very scary animals that can be in close conflict with people. And this right here tends to be the image that we have of crocodilians, right? They're large, they're aggressive. I mean, this video was taken from a helicopter during saltwater crocodile nesting, like egg harvest nesting collections. I mean, this is a largemouth saltwater crocodile that literally does not care that there's a helicopter in its territory. I mean, this, it's defending its area, and so this happens to be the public image. But how do we kind of get over that initial kind of shock and awe and fear factor and even start working with crocodilians or other species that we have little knowledge about, like pangolins, for example, which come with a whole suite of other kind of cultural, let's say, cultural significance. Black-bellied pangolins in Cameroon, for example, are recognized effectively as harbingers of death. And despite the fact that they're totally innocuous, they get killed on sight because it means for those people that if you kind of interact with an animal for too long, it might result in the death of you or someone close to your family member, a friend, or what have you. So, the idea is how do we get past some of these notions of either fear or cultural significance to really, dive in and work on species, right? And for crocodilians in particular, this is really important because globally, they're one of the most threatened groups of animals in the world. I mean, right now we have about 36% of all recognized crocodilians that are recognized as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. And if you compare that to the group of taxa that gets far and away the most conservation funding or research funding, for example, mammals, there's just no comparison whatsoever. The proportion of mammals in the world that are in a secure place or not threatened is much higher than for species like crocodilians, chelonians, even amphibians, right? But there's so fewer resources dedicated to them, and so it really takes a lot of self-drive and motivation, in particular from you guys as researchers and grad students looking at your future careers, to really undertake work on these species that is desperately needed, but it's always going to be an uphill swim for you. And crocodilians, of course, have one of the advantages of being really fascinating, aside from being really scary. I mean, they have amazing ecologies. They're highly resilient. You guys know that up here. Of course, the story in North Carolina, South Carolina, even Virginia in the wintertime as alligators, freeze underneath the water. There's not many animals that can really kind of drop their metabolism to do that. And then, of course, in other parts of the world, we don't have freezing temperatures. Crocodilians will just lock themselves in the mud, for example, or go underground into caves and caverns and estivate for many months at a time. They have shocking or like really amazing parental care behaviors and really interesting reproductive and mating interactions with each other. This is, of course, an American alligator doing a bellowing, but when we're talking about the West and Central African species, so West African slender-snouted crocodiles, not only do bellowing similar to this, but the males and females actually produce calls that they can do in time, like duetting, kind of like a bird. And the males and females can produce different calls that actually respond to each other in sync, much like bird duetting. And what's really fascinating is they can even switch roles in the calls, where some days the females will give the males calls, and some days the males will give the females calls. It's really quite fascinating. We don't really understand the purpose of it yet, but there's a lot of inherent kind of behavioral traits and attributes for these species that you can use to get that hook with the public, and that you can use to get that hook with your supervisors or administrators. And then, above and beyond their interesting basic biology, crocodilians in particular have a really significant cultural importance in the world. So this is a symbol that I filmed in northern Ghana. It's an Ashanti symbol. The word for it in Ashanti is Denchem Fenefu. Denchem is actually crocodilian or crocodile in the Ashanti language. And this is a really powerful symbol because it's effectively what the West African people in that region of West Africa refer to Siamese crocodiles. So you have three different crocodile heads sharing a stomach. And what this symbology is meant to represent is that despite the fact that we have lots of cultural differences between ourselves, between the different ethnic groups, we share common resources, we have common needs, and we can't keep fighting with each other and bite off our heads, or else the stomach is effectively going to die, right? And so this same symbology is seen around the world with crocodilians. And in reality, crocodilians are one of the most worshipped groups of species across cultures, across time. In Indonesia, Egypt, everywhere you look, there is a real significant cultural attachment. And even if they don't have the level of cultural attachment, they, of course, are very significant protein and financial resources for people in many, many places. Like when I opened this talk, the title of my talk was kind of parallel narratives of scaly critters. And pangolins, of course, are the other major group of taxa that I work on. I've been working on them for a significantly less amount of time, but they are obviously scaly. So that was a really easy transition for me, going from reptiles to the only scaled mammals, which I think is really fun. But there's a lot of parallel narratives in their conservation needs. Pangolins, if you don't know much about them, are recognized as potentially the most heavily illegally trafficked wild mammals in the world. I mean, they're traded in the millions of individuals per year, totally illegally, totally without any management or any control. And that's because people have, again, this really hardcore cultural attachment to them, and they have really significant protein and livelihoods and financial consequences for people everywhere that they occur in their range states. And of course, sometimes you get fortunate and your worlds collide. This is a really interesting picture. This is a mugger crocodile taking down an Indian pangolin. This picture was taken in a very specific watering hole in Yala National Park, which is the Crown Jewel National Park in Sri Lanka. And weirdly enough, every single year, some really lucky tourist is sitting in the blind at this watering hole and captures the same image. This happens all the time. And in some of so the species in the middle there is a black-bellied pangolin. It's one of the species I do a number of ecology work on, and we've had black-bellied pangolins actually drown in fishing nets trying to cross the river, and they just happen to get caught up in somebody's net. And so these animals are spending a lot of time in habitats where they can interact, which is kind of fun. Pangolins, of course, are, like we mentioned, they're heavily trafficked. Most of this is for their scales, destined now for East Asia, very specifically China and Vietnam, where it's integrated into traditional medicine recipes. Over the years, we've been quite successful in reducing that demand and getting the Chinese government to change their policy around pharmacopoeia. And so we're hoping that this continues to decrease. But even if the international scale trade doesn't starts to decrease, there's still a heavy demand for wild meat in all of their range states. And if you look at taste preference surveys for, okay, why do people choose this wild meat species versus that wild meat species? Pangolins are meant to be kind of like the bacon laced with crack, dipped in sugar of their range states. So they're heavily in demand. And so what we really need to be doing is trying to figure out, well, how can we work with local peoples to achieve this value-added conservation for pangolins that we've been able to achieve for crocodilians? But let me come back to that in a moment. So I work principally in West and Central Africa, and you can see that between the two regions, Central Africa, of course, has a fair amount of abundant forest habitat, intact forest left, whereas West Africa, it used to. All the light green is where there used to be a lot of forest. The dark green is where it still exists. And so, these are parts of the world that are The Congo Basin is referred to as the left lung of the world, with the Amazon as the right lung. It's a very important wetlands habitat. This area in northern Congo, for example, has the largest freshwater peat swamp forests in the world. And so it's a massive carbon sink and important for that. And then, of course, the area is very heavily populated. So this is a heat map of human population density. Places like Nigeria is in the next 10 years going to surpass the United States of America for the third most population dense region, highest human population density country in the world. They're already up over 300 million, I think, or getting really close to it, if not already, right? And so between West and Central Africa, you can actually see that one of the main drivers of habitat loss, of course, is this really dense human population compared to what we see in the Congo Basin. And this is just a blowout of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, where you can see that even as long ago as 1988, we lost something like 95% of natural forest cover. And so the challenges here are very, very real. And, that's one of the things that I find very appealing about it is, it is that challenge to go there and try to figure out how to work, how to make a difference. But it's also a really wide open niche space, not just for crocodilians, not just for pangolins, but there are so few people working on animals and wildlife conservation in this region of the world that if you're interested in anything that's not an elephant or a great ape, you can come here and do it, right? There's no competition for you. So I think that's really exciting. And of course, a lot of people do get a bit intimidated by West and Central Africa. One of the main things is one of the potential intimidating factors, of course, is infectious disease. If you guys remember back to 2015, actually the other Miriam I met, there was a raging Ebola epidemic happening in West Africa, right? And funny enough, despite the fact that that was really highly localized in Liberia and Sierra Leone, which are right over here, for example. And I had fieldwork going on in Cote d'Ivoire at that time. I mean, we were literally driving on a road that was 50 kilometers away from the epicenter of the outbreak in Liberia with no real consequences. But that epidemic had became such a mental barrier for people that even tourism, for example, in South Africa nearly died during the epidemic. I mean, people were like, "Oh, I can't possibly go to South Africa because there's Ebola in West Africa," and you're like, "That doesn't make any sense. There's a flu epidemic in Washington D.C., so you can't go to LA." Like, give me a break. And so people have a lot of weird misconceptions about the continent and especially this region. And but I would say it's misplaced or unfounded, which is a bit unfortunate. And so when I first started working in this region and in Africa in general, we recognized 3 crocodile species. There's the Nile crocodile, there's the dwarf crocodiles, and these are slender-snouted crocodiles. And here I've kind of mapped their individual distributions across a topographic map of Africa. And if we blow up onto that, and so again, this is basically the slender-snouted and dwarf crocodiles have the same nearly identical distributions, and this is Nile crocodiles. If we look a bit more closely, you start to think, is there any real reason to suspect that we only have 3 species of crocodile, right? I mean, you see really high elevation areas here. Crocodiles aren't really climbing mountains and going across the other side. So that's a potentially limiting gene flow. You have massive deserts in this whole area. And then down here, for example, this is a very dense forested area. This used to be a very dense forested area. This species requires open habitats with sandbanks. And so you start to really deep dive into and think about what's happening across the continent and asking yourself, right, should we really only have 3 species? And so this is a lot of the early work that I did, or this is work that I did early in my career, where we had to kind of figure this out. What's happening systematically and phylogenetically with the crocodilians of West and Central Africa, or the entire continent, if you will. And so myself and a couple other people went out and spent just a lot of time going up and down rivers all across the continent, grabbing as many samples as we possibly could. All of these points represent sampling locations, which we then brought back and subjected to a handful, or let's say a suite of species delimitation type analyses to figure out, is there ongoing gene flow or has there been a speciation process happening? And you don't have to pay too much attention to the labels here, but pay attention to the red clade and the white clade. These 2 clades are what we formerly considered to be Nile crocodiles. Right? But you can see that there is an entire clade of crocodilians in between them, and that's all 4 New World crocodile species. This is Cuban crocodile, American crocodile, Morelet's crocodile, and Orinoco crocodile, which are the sister taxa to Nile crocodiles as we know them today. But that entire group of Nile crocodiles here is paraphyletic, with respect to this group of quote unquote now crocodiles. And so these are the West African populations. It turns out that they're not even sister species. They're not even very closely related to each other. And there's a few more pieces of evidence that I'm going to expose, or I'm going to talk about in just a second. But we did a very similar thing for the slender-snouted and dwarf crocodiles. We didn't really run the risk of having a paraphyletic relationship because these are relatively, like, these genera have lost a lot of their diversity. But what we're seeing is reciprocally monophyletic clades that are isolated to geographic basins, or let's say biogeographic areas. And so these are all slender-snouted crocodiles from West Africa. These are all slender-snouted crocodiles from Central Africa. These are dwarf crocodiles from the lower Guinea Basin. These are dwarf crocodiles from the upper Guinea Basin, and these are dwarf crocodiles from the Congo Basin. So they're all reciprocally monophyletic, and divergence timing is in the 7 to 15 million years ago range. This is a really long divergence. These forested species are really kind of classic Pleistocene-ish, Pleistocene-adjacent forest refugia kind of capture phenomenon, right? So as forests were shrinking, the species had to shrink with them, and that basically limited gene flow for a certain amount of time. And then when forests expanded back, they were able to come into contact, but never did. We've not found a single case of introgression, hybridization, or gene flow between these reciprocally monophyletic clades. Going back to now crocodiles, we did some karyotype analysis. So if you're a believer in the biological species concept, for example, this is two entities that can reproduce and have fertile offspring should be considered the same species. Well, it turns out that East African and West African now crocodiles have totally different chromosome numbers. And not only totally different, but so different that if they were to reproduce, you'd have an odd number. You'd basically produce a mule, and the offspring would never be able to reproduce. They wouldn't be fertile. And there's been a number of instances in captivity where long-term, dozens of individuals of both species have been maintained in the exact same enclosure because we thought that they were all now crocodiles, and they've never reproduced a single time. There's not a single incident of hybridization known between them. And in the wild, we don't know any areas for certain where they all occur. Molecular barcoding was a really popular technique for a very, very long time that allows us to very rapidly identify a species using small genetic fragments. And what you're looking for here is a key difference between the genetic diversity represented within a species compared to the genetic diversity between two clades. And this gap here is the basically molecular barcoding gap. It allows you to identify them with certainty. And so all three species, their barcoding distances look exactly like this, where you have very replete genomes within any one taxa, but between them, you have very substantial divergence. And so this is like 5%. This is for the slender-snouted crocodiles. Between the dwarf crocodiles, it actually gets up to about 12%, depending on the pairs that we're talking about. And now crocodiles is about 5 or 6%. And I hate to quote this statistic because it's been kind of debunked for any number of reasons. But the classic standard between chimpanzees and humans is less than 1% for a genetic barcoding, right? So this gives you an idea for how divergent these lineages can actually be, less than 1% or less than 2%. And then, of course, without, like, genetics only get you so far. If you're dealing with like law enforcement or customs officials or researchers on the ground, you have to know how to identify the species in hand. And so we searched for a bunch of morphological characters on the cranial morphology, a bunch of scalation, and for every single species pair, we're finding somewhere between 5 and 15 very strong, discrete morphological characters that can be used to separate them, whether it's cranial or scalation based. And so at the end of the day, when we now go back and recognize that there's not just 3 species in Africa, but 7 crocodilian species, and we start to consider their conservation status, what we're noticing is that things that occur in East Africa or Central Africa tend to be relatively secure because there's very few people, a lot more habitat. For now, crocodiles in particular, East and Southern Africa were some of the pioneering countries for community-based natural resources management around crocodile harvest and skin and leather trade. Whereas in West Africa, very little work has been going on. Again, habitat loss, huge human populations. And so Crocodylus sucus, the West African crocodile, we're in the process of finishing its red list assessment, and it's somewhere between vulnerable and endangered compared to least concern for now crocodiles. And what's really kind of fun, just as a small interlude for this species, in order to figure out that Crocodylus sucus was the appropriate name for that taxa, we actually had to go back and sequence DNA from mummies that are about the 3,000 to 5,000 year old range, because Crocodylus sucus was actually described from a mummy that was pulled out of a temple in Egypt. And so even back then, this is Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, in the early 1800s recognized that there are some morphological differences between them, and it turns out the genetics really lines up. Now the question is, how did Crocodylus get into those temples, those pyramids to begin with, right? And so there's some evidence to suggest they might have occurred in the Nile Basin naturally, and they were just living in marginal habitats compared to the main river at the time. But the evidence is very weak. But as we all know, animals get traded very, very heavily, and have been for ages. And so my personal favorite hypothesis here is that a neighboring kingdom, so whoever was ruling Libya at the time, Libya had water. It was not always a desert. And so my personal hypothesis is that a Libyan, well, whoever was ruling, whatever they called themselves in the territory of Libya at the time, actually gifted them to an ancient Egyptian ruler who put them into these temples and raised them because they're smaller, they're more tractable, and they could basically mummify all these little babies and hand them out to parishioners as gifts for their worship. Similarly, for slender-snouted crocodiles, West African species is now, we estimate there's less than 500 adults in the wild, so it's a critically endangered animal. Whereas in Central Africa, and let's say just in one national park in Gabon, I could count 1,000 in one night. And so it's substantially less threatened, but they're pretty heavily depleted throughout most of DR Congo, for example, where bushmeat hunting is really, really rampant. And so they still kind of meet the qualifications for endangered because we think they've lost about 50% of their populations, but there's still enough habitat, enough places there that they're doing okay. And then we see the same phenomenon for dwarf crocodiles. In West Africa, this one is heavily depleted, critically endangered. And then these two are somewhere between vulnerable and endangered for those same reasons. And this is despite the fact, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, that Congo Basin dwarf crocodiles are the most heavily harvested crocodilian probably in the world. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of animals a year. There's not a single other wild crocodilian that has harvested in that numbers out of the wild as adults. We get a very substantial egg harvest of American alligators, but that's not really the same thing. And so after doing that research, I kind of pivoted and started working mostly on slender-snouted crocodiles in West Africa, a critically endangered species. And so trying to imagine, well, what can we do to go back and potentially supplement the populations in the wild? And fortunately, in the 1980s, the National Zoo in Cote d'Ivoire, there was a German development bank, so this is JIZ, and KfW, the German Development Bank and German Development Agency, so the equivalents of USAID, but for Germany, kind of created a breeding program. Because at the time, what they were really interested in is possibly the crocodile resource, so harvesting skin and trading meat and those sorts of things. But as they were going around and stocking this program with Nile crocodiles, what they thought were Nile crocodiles at the time, they already found out that even in the 80s, they were seeing virtually no slender-snouted crocodiles in the wild. And so they brought in they established a captive colony there of about 40 adult breeders. And unfortunately, our reproductive success is quite low because the zoo is very poorly maintained. They have virtually no animal welfare standards, no health and nutrition standards, et cetera. But every year they were getting 1, 2, or 3 nests. And so we've gone in there, we've kind of improved the animal welfare conditions, worked with the keepers, try to improve their diet. And now we get up to about 7 or 8 nests a year. But then now we have a fertility problem. And so now we're trying to figure out what the fertility issues are. But in any case, we have 20 or 30 babies that are in the plus or minus 1.5 to 2 meter range that need to go out. And every year, in theory, we can produce up to about 100 babies that we can use to restock if we didn't have some of the administrative hurdles to get through. One of those administrative hurdles, of course, is where do we put crocodiles that we're breeding in the zoo there? And so with one of my Ivorian PhD students, we undertook this exercise of trying to figure out if protected areas in Cote d'Ivoire or anywhere in West Africa might be suitable receiving sites for translocated crocodiles. And unfortunately, one of the things that we came to realize is that most protected areas in Africa, for the ease of management, use wetland features as delimitators. So this is like the river forms the protected area boundary because what they're interested in protecting is elephants and great apes, which, they need the river, but not in the same way. And then that also minimizes conflict with people because then the people can go in and continue their fishing activities without disturbing the mammals that they're really trying to protect. And at the end of the day, what we found out is that the protected areas don't actually do a very good job of protecting the crocodiles. Like even though the protected areas themselves have more crocodiles than non-protected areas, There's still significant boundaries. I mean, like the fishing, the detection rate of fishing nets was substantially higher in and around protected areas than it was outside of protected areas, because those are also the only places that are still maintaining fish populations, for example. And so the threats are really quite real and substantial. And then I was just mentioning to Thomas just before the talk that we did a preliminary analysis of mercury contamination in our crocodiles. And just draw your attention to this column right here, which is where we're seeing the mean mercury values per species. And you'll notice that the West African crocodilians have some of the highest mercury contamination loads of any species analyzed to date. And what's really fascinating in particular is Gabon, which is widely believed to be the most pristine intact habitat in the entirety of Africa, have the highest loads. And then when you kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, you realize that Gabon has a massive petroleum extraction industry and other mining ventures that are happening. And then also, and this is something I would love to talk to you guys about. Apparently, intact ecosystems can actually risk having higher mercury contamination loads because the food chains are actually more intact. And so you can have a slightly higher rate of bioaccumulation potentially. But this is a very preliminary study that we need to build on to figure out what sort of new industrial extraction regulations do we need to put in place to potentially protect these species in the future? And in addition to things like heavy metal contaminations, there's all sorts of organic pollutants from the rampant use of fertilizers and pesticides and everything else. And then microplastics are going to be a huge thing. There's not a single waterway that I've been in most of West Africa that isn't just jammed full of like plastic pollution. And of course, this is a really massive problem or potential concern for human population health as well, because humans subsist largely on fish and other aquatic resources in this part of the world. And so I think there's a lot of avenues for research coming in and trying to figure out what's happening here and making that link to human population health to actually get authorities to start really caring about these issues would be really, really important in the future. And so as part of this, before we do the reintroductions, we're going in and doing a lot of training with national parks staff, getting them to understand the importance of not only the crocodiles, but the wetlands habitats, and also the importance of doing patrolling based on the wetlands areas. Because I mean, if these are the boundaries of the park, and these are the only roadways, sometimes a river is the only roadway to get into the park, this is also a really important choke point for them to do law enforcement and control. I mean, people have to be going up the river, they have to be camping next to the river because this is where they're getting their water, those sorts of things. And so we're slowly changing minds on how they approach both care about crocodiles, but then approach law enforcement activities. And then, of course, this is also all butting up against the very strong cultural reality that people want crocodiles for some purpose or another, whether it's to eat their meat or to have fashion accessories like belts and wallets and what have you. And one of the things that I really love about working with crocodiles is that this value add approach to conservation, where the species becomes a sustainable natural resource that's constantly providing benefits to people, is a proven model. It's not proven for every species, mind you, but many of you might know that American alligators, even if we go back to the 1950s, we estimate the population was less than about 100,000 individuals across the entire southeastern United States. So after a very brief period of protection, once we started the harvest program up again, that's what really allowed landowners throughout the southeastern United States to attach value to alligator populations and not convert their land to things like sugar cane or whatever it happens to be. And now we have about 6 million American alligators throughout the entire distribution. And this is a really important conservation model. This is a figure from the freshwater crocodile harvests in New Guinea. When they first started doing monitoring of the New Guinea freshwater crocodiles in the 70s, they had less than 10,000 nests per year on the entire island. And then as the harvest model was introduced and local communities throughout, and this is very particularly from the Sepik wetland area, were convinced to protect their traditional hunting grounds and not, put in invasive plants, not go in and hunt out adult crocodiles for skin trade and meat. You can see that eventually the nesting populations really ramped up. The population exploded quite heavily. And so this is a really important lesson that we can possibly learn and bring into my system in Central Africa. So let's go back to the very beginning when I told you that Congo Basin dwarf crocodiles are probably the most harvested crocodilian in the world, especially one outside of a management program. program. Well, bushmeat harvest is not any less bushmeat, or so wild meat is not any less legitimate of a resource than leather trade, for example. We're talking a difference in scale of economies, but it's also relevant to the local population that we're talking about. A whole dwarf crocodile purchased from the hunter in this system can go for in between $10 and $50. But by the time they transport that crocodilian downstream to Brazzaville, for example, which is the capital, or Kinshasa, or by the time it gets into Brazzaville or Kinshasa, it gets on a Brussels Airways flight and makes it up to Brussels or to Paris or to London, for example. And there actually is a very large diaspora, West and Central African diaspora in Europe now, that still wants to eat this bushmeat. It goes for hundreds of dollars, for example. And so it's an economy of scales question. And so what we've been doing is working with the communities of the Lac Tele Community Reserve. And these are the heads of all the major crocodile hunting clans from this one particular village, right? Trying to get them to, let's say, agree to participate in a collaborative dwarf crocodile harvest management program, where some of the benefits that we might provide, for example, reducing their exposure to law enforcement by helping them get the required permits, for example, to ensure that their activities are legal. We can supply them with dedicated crocodile transportation boats, which then makes it much more easy to control, because that basically means if you're not a registered crocodile transportation boat and you're transporting crocodiles, that's illegal all of a sudden, right? And then we start cutting out middlemen. And instead of all of a sudden this crocodile going for $10 to $25 at the village level, this crocodile can go for $100 at the village level. And then I can start convincing people, okay, well, now you can now harvest like a quarter of the crocodiles you were harvesting before, for example, to get the same benefits that you were deriving. And so as part of this, we were doing some monitoring to figure out how many crocodiles were coming out. So we put observers at these different choke points and exit points along the rivers. And we're estimating that just from Lac Tele alone, tens of thousands of dwarf crocodiles are being exported from the area annually. That doesn't include the consumption locally. We're starting to work with hunters who are allowing us to basically LoJack them. So we put GPS devices on the hunters themselves to start monitoring their mapping their hunting territories to figure out how we can put in place a spatially explicit harvest regime, for example. And we're starting to figure out, out of all their hunting attempts, so the red dots are burrows that they tried to extract crocodiles from that were empty. The blue dots were burrows where they actually got crocodiles, for example. We can get a better understanding of their catch per unit effort, so that we can really kind of fine tune in on the economy that they might need to be convinced to really join a sustainable harvest management program. Pangolins, of course, have the same problem. I already mentioned they're, the bacon dipped in crack, laced in sugar of Central Africa. And so they're very heavily traded for bushmeat as well. But despite that trade in bushmeat, the populations of pangolins in West and Central Africa are now the major suppliers for the international scale trade, which basically means they've been subsisting for hundreds, if not thousands of years underneath a certain harvest pressure from the local communities. And if it weren't for the international trade and associated habitat loss, maybe we wouldn't have this problem in terms of their population status. So there's 8 species of pangolin in the world. All of them are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And the Asian species are the ones that are typically recognized as critically endangered now, because they're at the very least economically extinct. There's not a lot of harvest going on with them anymore. And with the Chinese Belts and Railways initiative happening out in the world, they get a lot of harvest and trade from Central and West Africa. So we're trying to get ahead of the game there, which is a bit challenging, especially because we know very little about pangolins. They're very difficult to study. They're very difficult to find, which is a bit ironic, because how can they be traded in such high quantities if we as researchers can't find them? And of course, it turns out that hunters just use a bunch of unscrupulous techniques that we're not allowed to use, right? We can't chase pangolins down with dogs. We can't cut down their habitat. We can't dig out their burrows, that sort of stuff. And we obviously can't deploy thousands and thousands of cable snare traps, which are indiscriminate hunters, indiscriminate harvesters, effectively. And so some of the stuff that we're working on is basically trying to figure out, what are some pangolin spatial ecology. And so this is movements of black-bellied pangolins in the Zanga-Zanga National Park in Central African Republic. They have very, very small home ranges. I mean, we're talking 30 to 50, well, let's say between 10 and 50 hectares, which if you put that in terms of football fields, for example, this is a handful of American football fields is the home range of any one pangolin. So it's a very small area. And within that area, we actually think that they can occur at relatively high abundances. And so this is a stretch of river that's about 1 kilometer long, This is a band that I put on of just 10 meters width from the river's edge. And this is one of our study sites where we're tagging white-bellied and black-bellied pangolins. And so you can see that they can kind of, just based on our capture efforts, they can occur at relatively high densities. I mean, over 1 pangolin per hectare. And it also means they don't have a lot of the territoriality problems. They're not excluding each other from space, that sort of stuff. And so they can be quite dense and abundant. But if we are to, for example, embark on a process of, let's say, a sustainable use-based management or harvest management, that of course necessitates a monitoring to figure out, make sure that we're not over-harvesting and we're not having a detrimental impact on the population. But as we said already, pangolins are very difficult to find and monitor in the wild. And just to give you an example of that, these are all of the EcoGuard patrols in Kakum National Park, which is in Ghana, between 2016 and 2018. At total, this is 17,000 kilometers of patrols that they did, and they saw a total of 120 pangolins over that time. And so recce transects or distance transects probably are not effective pangolin monitoring tools. And we published a paper a handful of years ago. There was a meta-analysis of pangolin detections in camera trap surveys, for example. And pangolins are bycatch in most camera trap surveys in the region because they're all targeting apes and elephants. But even then, we have very little detections on camera traps. And so the lessons we took away from there are that pangolins do not really use camera trapped features. So we mostly camera trap like animal trails and clearings and things like that. And pangolins are just wandering all throughout the forest. And so like that sort of targeted or spatially explicit camera trapping design may not work. And so what we're trying to do now, and especially in recognition of the fact that some of these species are largely arboreal, is stick camera traps all the way up into the tree canopy. And so as we speak, I've got a couple of camera trap grids out in Cameroon and Gabon, where we have 6 or 7 cameras from about knee level all the way up to the top of the tree. And we're trying to figure out, okay, well, A, it's not economical to place 7 cameras in a single tree just to detect pangolins. And B, that means we also have much less coverage for the money that we have. And so one of the things we're trying to work out is how many cameras do we need per tree to reliably, detect a pangolin that might be moving through it, and at what height should they be deployed in the tree. And so this is some preliminary results from a different study site in Guinea, where we're actually figuring out that the mid height levels are more appropriate than the very top or the very bottom. But still, the models suggest that we need like 3 or 4 cameras per tree. Of course, this is going to vary by population density of pangolins as we move around the world. And so we're hoping our Cameroon and Gabon results are a little bit more informative moving forward. It turns out that, we're actually onto something. This is a white-bellied pangolin that was sleeping right here in the fork of this tree at about 25 meters up as our teams were there deploying camera traps in the canopy. And so hopefully this is going to provide a slightly better estimate of population abundance. And of course, one of the really fun things is that camera traps have never really been deployed arboreally in Central Africa before. And so we're just getting a boatload of information on stuff that people didn't even really know were there, has never been studied. I mean, things like the small carnivores, these are anomalers. This is Africa's version of flying squirrels. Except for our flying squirrels in America are about this big. Those flying squirrels are about this big. They're huge, which is really cool. There's all sorts of nocturnal primates that are in these areas. And then of course, we're picking up everything else that everybody normally picks up on camera traps, and of course, pangolins. One of the next thing that we're trying to do, in addition to deploying arboreal camera traps, especially in the age of AI, how many people here are working with like computer vision for anything, or machine learning or AI for anything whatsoever? Right? So a little bit. So one of the things that's really kind of starting to revolutionize the big camera trapping world is the automated detection and identification of species in camera traps. But I mean, even just looking at these 6 images, you can see that camera traps, it's a very difficult context. Optical photos for camera traps are really difficult to develop and train models on, because of the very diverse pixel structure in optical camera traps. So it's night versus day, for example. A lot of darkness here, a lot of lightness here. You have the flash and all these sorts of effects. And so one of the things that we're trying to do to combat this is see if thermal technology might be able to overcome. Where on the one hand, it may be quite difficult to say, okay, this is a white-bellied versus a black-bellied pangolin in thermal imagery, right? But at the bare minimum, you can see that thermal imagery pixels have a very constant structure throughout. And so it might be faster and easier for us to develop automated models to detect pangolins in our imagery with thermal camera traps. Thermal camera traps can also have a better depth of field and more clear vision than optical camera traps. And so starting later this month, we're actually going to put thermal cameras into the grid next to optical cameras for our entire camera trap deployment design. And so that way we can kind of at least see, okay, well, what was this definitively in the thermal imagery with the optical imagery, and then start training models on the thermal imagery. So we're pretty excited about that moving forward. And then how many of you guys have ever seen animal-borne camera on an alligator or anything else? Nat Geo did it, and there's been some stuff on critter cams from Nat Geo. We worked with that team, and we're able to develop a very small critter cam to put on a black-bellied pangolin or a series of black-bellied pangolins to kind of figure out, okay, well, what are you doing in your habitat? What small micro niches are you occupying? How are you evading detection? How often are you up in the canopy versus on the ground? What exact resources are you consuming? And we're hopeful that this is going to give us a better feel for how these animals, to the extent that they do, maybe avoid detection by people. And by having a better understanding of their activity cycles, we can also work with these protected areas that have, for example, non-timber forest product harvest, or allow communities to go in and do X, Y, or Z to kind of structure their time to minimize the probability of encounter with pangolins while they're out in the forest. But moving kind of beyond species ecology to try to better understand some of the threat factors. So this is a couple of pangolin scale shipments. The one on the left is in Cote d'Ivoire. It's about 3 tons. The one on the right, that's about a 14-ton seizure that happened in Singapore about 10 years ago. And pangolin scales are almost unanimously or exclusively shipped around the world in these big bags, like rice bags, 50-kilo bags per shipment. But the problem is, to date, one of the main problems is that pangolins are often just discussed as pangolins, right? Not white-bellied pangolins, not black-bellied pangolins, just pangolins across the board. And so when someone says, oh, we seized 14 tons of pangolin scales, what does that actually mean? What is the individual species impact of that seizure? And are certain pangolins being more impacted than others around the world? And so I've done this now a number of times with about 30 metric tons of pangolin scales, where I go in with a team of people and we literally go scale by scale. This is this species, this is this species, this is this species. And while that is terrible, terrible, tedious, dirty, obnoxious work that I do not wish on anybody, it's providing some really good insights. And so what we're able to do now is come up with an understanding of the expected scale mass per species of pangolin, right? And so before, whenever these seizures were had, people used this 360 grams of scales per individual pangolin as the standard kind of conversion factor, right? But if you notice, giant pangolins might have as many as 4 kilograms of scales on a single giant pangolin, whereas white-bellied pangolins might only have 200 grams of scales per pangolin. And so it's really important to understand not only these conversion factors on a species-specific basis, but within any given seizure, what's the composition of scales? So you can actually really figure out the species-specific impact. You can start figuring out where the scales come from, for example. And if you then apply a different conversion factor or a species-specific conversion factor, it gives you a better understanding of the impact per species. And so this is 3 different seizures. This is the total mass of each seizure, for example. And if we take the standard conversion factor that was used prior to this research, we estimated about 33,000 pangolins for any one of these seizures, right? But if you consider that the single most harvested and traded pangolin species that we're encountering is white-bellied pangolins at 200 grams of scales per individual, this number all of a sudden is almost doubled, right? In terms of the number of pangolins that are being pulled out. And then, of course, if you take a bit more into consideration the composition, where some of these are giant pangolins, for example, it's still a higher amount than what we were estimating previously, but still very, very large. And, if you take that 14-ton seizure in Singapore, if that was all white-bellied pangolins, for example, that might be 96,000 pangolins. 96,000 pangolins, right? Let that sink in for half a second. What other species can anyone cite right now, aside from like bluefin tuna, for example, or cod or whatever, that gets harvested in that quantity? And what outside of a management program? Like none of them. And so this is like, it's this that haunts my dreams every day, because I can't help but think to myself, if we were back in the 80s or 90s, had we started implementing a managed harvest program with this very simple traceability system, we might not be in a pangolin crisis right now. But now what we're doing is we're playing catch up, and the global appetite for pangolin harvest is really quite low still, despite the fact that they are really heavily harvested species. And so, there's oftentimes a figure that gets thrown around, like in the period 2010 to 2020, we estimate about 1 million pangolins were harvested. What we actually mean is we estimate about 1 million pangolins where the scales were seized. Okay. Anyone have any idea for the average seizure rates per illicit product, according to like Interpol, for example? Average between 5 and 15% at best. 15% is for highly visible products like whole automobiles. 5% or less is for things like guns, children, drugs, that sort of stuff. And so if you consider that, let's say even take 10% of pangolin seizures have been intercepted, we're all of a sudden talking about 10 million pangolins over that same time frame, right? That's staggering. It's crazy. And despite us having this knowledge or supposed knowledge of the penguin trafficking, we don't really know much about trafficking dynamics. And so this is actually a really cool piece of research that we're just getting ready to start doing. This is a 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter GPS chip that we've been able to figure out how to basically we can 3D print a giant pangolin scale replica housing that doesn't feel the same as a scale, but it looks nearly identical. Stick this tracker into the middle of it, drop that off into the village where they're harvesting giant pangolins, for example. It eventually makes its way up into a massive international shipment like this, and we can track it all the way back to China and figure out who's consuming these things. What are the dynamics? How long does it take to go from Forest Gate to the port? How long does it take to go from the port to the receiving port in China or Vietnam? And where does it go from there? And so keep your eyes out. Hopefully we'll make some good breakaways there. And then just to wrap up, so Miriam, when she introduced me, said that I'm the chair of the Penguin Specialist Group, the regional chair for West and Central Africa for the Crocodile Specialist Group. And for both of these organizations, I represent both of these specialist groups on the IUCN delegation to CITES. So what these affiliations allow me to do effectively is to really scale up the impact that I'm doing, or that I'm able to have via, for example, engaging in policy fora, or having a massive global network of collaborators. When I took over the Penguin Specialist Group, for example, we had about 110 members. We now have about 260 members because I've prioritized basically finding anyone and everyone who's working on pangolins and bringing them into the group. Because it doesn't matter if you're a master's student or a senior researcher with 40 years of experience under your belt, you have valuable information to add. And the same thing for the Crocodile Specialist Group. When I took over the region, we had 3 members. Now we have like 25 members. And they all have varying levels of activity and whatever, but it's all really critical to their development, to your development. For example, you're a member, right? Are you a member? You yet? Not yet. So we got a couple, and Thomas, of course. I have a couple of Crocodile Specialist Group members in the audience who can test themselves. And just being part of this network, it opens doors, opens opportunities, opens collaborations, and it allows you to understand what's happening a bit more globally with things. And in the case of the Penguin Specialist Group, for example, back in 2016 is when the CITES COP was in Johannesburg. The Penguin Specialist Group was able to kind of rally its troops to really liaise with all the range states, the parties to CITES, and eventually convince everyone to vote to uplist pangolins from CITES Appendix 2 to CITES Appendix 1, which means that no commercial trade is legal in the future. And that's been quite successful. And on the back of that, we've been able to start up behavior change campaigns where, like I mentioned, we actually achieved policy change in China. Pangolins are now removed from the formal Chinese pharmacopoeia as a result of those behavior change campaigns and as a result of these sorts of interventions, which is unheard of. I mean, like China doesn't change their policy for anybody, right? It's massive. And then what's also really cool is that within CITES, pangolins have a dedicated conservation resolution. This is Resolution Conference 17.10. There are 3 groups of species in the entire convention that have dedicated conservation resolutions, and we're one of them. And what's really amazing is that because of our interventions within the context of CITES, the last conference of parties in Uzbekistan, the CITES Secretariat formally passed, I want to say control, but let's say oversight of implementation of this resolution to the Penguin Specialist Group, which opens up massive doors in terms of our ability to collaborate with and influence governments and how they approach policy decisions, how they approach harvest monitoring, sanctions, all this sort of stuff. So we're really excited to see what we can be doing with that moving forward. And then, of course, capacity building is important everywhere. This is why we train grad students, but importantly in West and Central Africa, people don't really have the opportunity to, or have much fewer opportunity to participate in like science programs that lead to management interventions. The resources that are available there are much smaller, and so I encourage everybody here to take these opportunities to bring in people that can work as either interns or graduate students or whatever on your programs. The more that you can link with communities in particular, the better. And eventually, what my hope is, and I'm kind of in the long game here, I've actually decided that, I love science, but let's face it, a lot of my science is kind of basic stuff. It's not really super advanced because that's the state of the world in the areas that I work. But that doesn't bother me at all, because what my long game is eventually my mentees becoming the national parks directors and the wildlife directors at the government level for all these countries. And then I can assure that I know someone's in there that has a really rigorous conservation science background, actually cares about the species that they're trying to protect, and knows how to gain resources because they're plugged into, for example, the global community. Like in West Africa now, for example, we have the young West and Central African crocodile specialist group, right? This is a group of 10 or 12 people that were all in their master's or PhD stage that decided to come together and create their own sub-network to continue pushing each other forward and maintaining that contact with crocodilians, maintaining a rigorous science basis. And with that, obviously, all this work takes a lot of funding and resources. And so I want to thank all my donors, of course. Thank you guys for listening. And I really appreciate being invited. Hope you found my talk informative. And I'm here for any questions you might have. Oh, and obviously also reach out. If you're interested in anything West or Central Africa, anything pangolins, anything crocodiles, any of the specialist groups, get in touch. I love network building. All right, thanks. I'm right about on time, I think. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about female bellowing American alligators during. So we know that they bellow during the springtime or the mating season or the courtship period, but we are actually looking at some female alligators who are bellowing during the nesting period, about July, August, or something like that. So, and we sometimes see male alligators in those guard holes as well, where we have set up our cameras and stuff like that. So, is it kind of new, or is it kind of pretty normal? Have you heard of this female bellowing during June, July, or something?
So I don't work on alligators, except for kind of on the fun in my free time back when I was in grad school. So I don't really know for alligators very specifically. I'd be more than happy to turn that question mostly over to Thomas. But I do, female crocodilians bellowing is not a very unique thing. It's been documented across most species for a while, but we haven't really studied it. And so I don't think we actually really know why they're doing it or what. But Thomas, do you have any other thoughts for American alligators especially?
No, actually, Randy just sent me photographs recently. We have game cameras up on nest sites, and sometimes last year we did guard holes. And every now and then we'll just some pictures this week of with her head up and Christine, she's bellowing. And there'll be times even in the fall, even sometimes where I was thinking that most of the bellowing was during the breeding season, but we hear it sometimes year round. So I have no idea.
Yeah, globally, all crocodilians are highly social and highly vocal species, and so and I would imagine their vocal repertoire is relatively limited, just given the structure of their vocal cords and larynx and everything else. And so it could just be that they're using the same sorts of signals at different times of year to communicate different things, which is almost certainly the case. But what that is, I think it definitely merits a bit more research for sure. Yeah.
Now, this is a penguin-specific question. This is not a species that I'm about, but are the scales of the penguin similar to like hair, where they're primarily hairless?
It's 100% keratin, has zero biomedical value whatsoever.
I was wondering, because you can't do with a penguin like what you can do with a rhinoceros in Africa, where you just kind of shave the horn off, basically, and now the animal's no longer valuable in that sense. But would there be any way in which you could sustainably harvest penguin scales without killing the animal?
No, unfortunately, you can't harvest the scales without killing them. It would be highly traumatic to rip off the scales, and the animal would probably just die of pain and stress eventually, even if they didn't need the scales for their defense and protection. But if you they do lose scales from time to time, not naturally, they get ripped off for various reasons, especially on a predation attempt or something to that effect. And it's it's a little bit bloody, and then the wound eventually heals, and it's kind of fine, but it never grows back.
Trim it nail.
You could, in theory, trim it, but that would have the same problem because I think the growth rate would be very, very slow. I mean, the scales do continually grow throughout the course of life, and they just get eroded at the end, which is why they don't like grow out like those really creepy Guinness Book of World Records fingernails, right? No. So what we're trying to think of, like the alternatives, well, the ways that this could be approached is one, there's a handful of people that are working on production of pangolins in captivity to potentially supply the trade, but they don't have. I'm not going to go so far as to say they have slow reproductive rates, but it takes them between 3 and 8 years, let's say, to get to sexual maturity. They have one baby every 6 months, give or take, and so it's kind of low. And then, of course, the baby has to grow out for 2 years before they're big enough for the scales to be harvestable or interesting. And so, potentially, captive breeding is an option, but you have to produce them in a huge scale, like quantity, to make it worthwhile. The other option is just like working with communities to really go in and get commitments to structured and limited harvest opportunities. But then I think the other thing that most people are really trying to tackle is alternatives on the use side. And so we have a big program with traditional medicine, which didn't mention at all, with traditional medicine in Benin and the use of pangolins and other threatened species there for both religious purposes, where voodoo was born, and meat purposes or scale trade for other reasons. And then on the Chinese side, they're working on this as well. And what we're trying to dig into is what will traditional medicine users accept as an alternative to pangolin scales as an ingredient. And like I said, personally, I lament that we even have to have this conversation. I'd rather people just be able to use them on a sustainable basis, but this is kind of where we are. And so we'll see how that works going forward. And fortunately, a lot of user groups are really open-minded to this, because even really hardcore like Chinese traditional medicine users really understand that the most effective ingredients are kind of like a one-to-one effect. Like it's an ingredient that's used for like one particular ailment, right? Or a handful of ailments that are kind of related to each other, or your like overall boost to your health and immune system, like ginkgo biloba and what have you. Whereas pangolin scales, the list is like 500 ailments long. And so even they are starting to realize it's a little too much. It's not really feasible. Or not really like it's not likely that it has like a strong impact on all those things. So yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
If there are any questions online, just unmute yourself and say them if you have any.
It's amazing. I mean, I one of the sometimes hard for me to wrap my head around the size of the area, talking where these penguins exist. I'm just amazed at that level of harvest. There's any left. I mean,
Yeah.
The rate. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, my personal theory on this, and actually I've got a paper in the works right now. We're doing some modeling of harvest rates to kind of figure out what may or may not be sustainable, or what reduces in real population decline. But if you think about it, these are small mammals, like especially the white-bellied and black-bellied penguins. They have a maximum body size of 2 kilograms, and they subsist on ants and termites. They're exclusive ant and termite feeders. I mean, ants and termites are literally the architects of the world, and they're the most abundant animal-based protein resource on the planet. And so you just have to figure that they have, between their small space needs, the fact that they can just kind of curl up in a bromeliad and eat ants all day, you got to imagine that at some point in time they were just super abundant, right?
Yeah, I know a friend from Himalayas, he sent me a pangolin, picture, and they caught him, and there's a huge demand for these animals. So,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. The Himalayas, there's so like Nepal, I'm assuming you're kind of talking about.
not the foothills.
Yeah.
We're just they start. I'll show you the videos after.
No, exactly. But I was gonna say, I mean, so there's a lot of good work happening in Nepal where, so for example, one of the things that we figured out is that pangolins can persist quite successfully in degraded habitats. And if you think about it, there's an inverse relationship between habitat degradation and ant and termite abundance and diversity. And so we think that those slightly degraded habitats, like plantations, and in the case of the foothills, like tea plantations and stuff like that, might offer really significant resources. And so we're trying to figure out ways to start working with large industrial agricultural producers for tea, cacao, palm oil, and things like that, to basically convert plantations that are adjacent forest areas into extended conservation estate by changing behavior of like the workers in those plantations and have them just leave the pangolins instead of harvest them. And so there's a group of people in Nepal that are working on that quite heavily. And then Nepal actually might be a convergence point of unrecognized cryptic diversity for pangolins. I've got 2 papers on my desk that I have to review that are trying to describe new species from the kind of the gradient across Nepal, which is interesting. Yeah.
Okay, this place which I'm mentioning, it's about 500 miles from Nepal.
Okay, in India or, okay, yeah, cool, very cool.
Any other questions in person or online?
If you had time, I had one more quick one. Also involving the pangolins, something that kind of got brought to mind that I kind of thought of when you mentioned it. You were talking about how there was a cultural perception in pangolins in Africa as being kind of, harbingers of, bad things, death and whatnot. And it reminds me of, because I always wonder with some of these cultural, whether there's kind of like at least a tiny kernel of truth in what they're talking about with that. So what could potentially be the case for pangolins is, I know for armadillos here in North America, which are very similar to pangolins in terms of how they live, stuff like that, are very frequent carriers of leprosy, which can spread to humans. So you think, is there a possibility that maybe a disease transmission could have led to that cultural association with death, where people who interact with pangolins are, maybe getting sick, and then, they're associating it directly rather than some sort of biological mediator between the two?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have two answers to that. One is the biological answer, which is that, and especially if you guys maybe remember when the COVID pandemic was happening, pangolins were supposedly linked very tightly because of some early research that showed that the pangolin SARS virus had a very similar genome to the human SARS virus and blah, blah, blah. We've since kind of debunked that, and also that, there hasn't been a pangolin in the Wuhan wet market for months or years prior to that, and et cetera. And then then the other half of that is the cultural answer, which is, it almost doesn't matter. It's really like, what's most important is what people believe and what they feel, and the strength of their conviction in that. And this is why, for me, one of the things that I've been really trying to do within the Pangolin Specialist Group in particular is get people to understand that, like, our beliefs or our biological knowledge is kind of irrelevant when we're talking about these local user groups, and it's really what they consider important and what they consider to be real, and how do we work within those belief systems to get themselves to diminish, mitigate the threat, or potentially just change their behavior and decide that it's not an interesting resource or what have you. And that's really the most important part. Yeah. But no, I mean, by the time you think about, the millions of pangolins that are harvested every year, and the potential blood and fluid exposure and contact, and the fact that no one's really ever had a documented disease transmission, compared to, for example, every single Ebola outbreak we know has come from a chimpanzee harvest, right? A dead chimpanzee harvest. And so, eventually we would probably have a documented case of some kind, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Nice, thanks everybody who joined us online, in person. We're gonna finish it off. Thanks for joining us, Matt, and that was really awesome.
Excellent, thanks everybody.